The next function I'd like to explore with you is called iterate. This is likewise a function that exists in the Clojure language. And in the Clojure documentation, it says that iterate is a function that takes two arguments, f and x, and it returns a collection of first x, then f of x, and then f of x, and so forth. So basically, you're going to first return the value that you're given, then you're going to invoke the function that you're given with that value. You're going to remember the result, and then you're going to invoke the function again with that result, and so forth. This is useful, for example, to generate a list of integers that get larger and larger. Now, how might one implement this in the traditional paradigm? Well, we could say iterate is equal to a function that takes a function f, some value x, and then also we're going to have to take some number of how many items we want the collection to have, because in Clojure there's such a thing as lazy sequences, but we don't want to bother with this right now. We're only going to return a finite collection. Okay, now in the traditional approach, we could say something like results again, prepare something again, and by now you're pretty familiar with this, I'm sure. Now what we're going to do is iterate, and this time we're going to use n as a limit, and then we're going to say push onto the results array x, and then override x and say it's now f of x. So next time it iterates, f of x gets pushed onto the results array, then f of x, and so forth, until we're done iterating. And then we return the results. Now let's run this. We could run this, for example, with ink. And let's say we start at 1, and let's say we want 20 of them. And there you go. So we get a list of 1 to 20. So this is pretty cool. But now I want to encourage you to pause the video here and think about how you might implement this in terms of the functional approach. Now, if you've given this a shot, we can do it together. We're going to rename this to iterate old. And the signature is going to be the same. And again, this is all going to look very familiar. We're going to say is n 0? Well, then we have nothing left to return. We're just going to return an empty collection. But if it isn't 0, then we have more stuff to do. And what we want to do in that scenario is we want to return a newly constructed list that starts with x and then iterates again with f of x, and a decremented value of n. And that's really it. So let's run this again. Iterate of ink and start with 1. Start with 1. And we want 20 of them. And there you go. It works the same way. Now, what else could we use this for? Well, we can actually use it to implement repeat in terms of iterate. So I want to encourage you to pause the video once more and try it for yourself. Try implementing repeat in terms of iterate. And just to remind you, repeat takes two numbers, a and b, and it returns an array with b repeated a times. How might one do this using iterate? Now, if you've given this a try, let's try it together. I'm going to call this repeat iterate. and it's going to take A and B like before. And then what it's going to do is return iterate. Now we have to think about what kind of function do we want to use, because we're not incrementing this time. We want the number or the element that's passed to always be the same. We don't want it to change. So in that case, what we can do is we can use something called the identity function. That's about the simplest function there is. All it does is it takes some value and returns that value. So that's the function we're going to pass to iterate, identity. And we're going to start with B, and we're going to iterate A times. Now let's run this and see if it works. Repeat iterate. We want to repeat, say, the number 3 4 times. And there you go. It works.